Hi, and welcome to The Working Songwriter, the show where today's best songwriters come to talk shop. I'm your host, Joe Pug. Each episode here, we host a distinguished guest, and we ask them to go deep on their inspiration, on their process, on the general ups and downs of making a life in music. So, whether you're a grizzled veteran doing a Facebook Live concert for your cult classic debut album from 1979, or else a scrappy upstart, doing a live stream to Twitch while young gamers spew 4chan hate speech at you in the comments, this is your show. Because ultimately, it is what every writer seeks most, an ironclad excuse to put off actually writing. Hey guys, it's the third Friday of May, 2020, and I'm glad that you're here. Thanks for joining us. This week's show is brought to you by Bandzoogle. Built by musicians and for musicians, Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform to build a beautiful, beautiful website for your music. I am old enough to remember when we had to use somebody called a web developer to get a website made, and a web developer was always some guy named Dietrich, who was always wearing like a baggy silk shirt that had a Guy Fawkes mask, one of those anonymous masks emblazoned on it, and who wouldn't shut up about something called the dark web the whole time that he was building your website. And old Dietrich would charge you about $1,000 for a website that would be obsolete in 6 months. It's the future now, you guys. We don't have to deal with the Dietrichs of the world anymore. We have nice things. Bandzoogle is one of those nice things, and it powers the websites of tens of thousands of musicians around the world, from weekend warriors to Grammy winners. All the features you need for a professional website, they're already built in. Hosting and a custom domain name, dozens of fully customizable design templates, mailing list tools, social media integrations, the ability to sell tickets to a live streaming event, I think is something I just saw online that they do. So it's a really great deal. The Working Songwriter podcast listeners can go to bandzoogle.com to try it for free for 30 days. And just use the promo code TWS to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. Thank you, Bandzoogle. If you'd like to hear some of my music live, I will be live streaming my album In the Meantime, which came out in about 2010. That'll be on my YouTube channel this Sunday night at 9 p.m. And of course, I'll also be doing requests and taking questions and just generally having a good time. Finally, if you enjoy this podcast, if you'd like to help it remain a viable endeavor for me, there's a couple of things that you could do to help. The first thing that you could do is become a supporter over at Patreon. Patreon is a platform that allows you to support creative endeavors that you love and find meaningful. Basically, think of it as a voluntary subscription. You just head over to patreon.com, Patreon, search for my name or The Working Songwriter, and then you just sign up to kick in a few bucks every month. If just 1% of our listenership would kick in the price of a cup of coffee every month, I would be in a great shape to make it through the pandemic without being able to tour. So I'd love it if you'd sign up over there, and if you can't do that, I totally get it. There's a couple ways that you can help out that are free. You could leave us a rating in the iTunes store, or you could also just tell a friend that you think would dig the show. And the simple math on those two things is that they will help me much more than they will be a pain in the ass for you. So I'll end all the harassment there. Chris Porterfield is an old friend of mine, and it was so great catching up with him. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Originally from Minnesota and now an artistic mainstay in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Chris Porterfield is the creative force behind the modern folk songwriting of Field Report. After playing the role of sideman in DeArmond Edison, a group that was composed of future members of Megafaun and Bon Iver, Porterfield struck out on his own to compose songs commensurate with his own vision. After recording his debut album at Justin Vernon's April Base Studios, the record was met with widespread critical adulation. Field Report stepped onto the national stage and went on to tour with Emmylou Harris, Counting Crows, Amy Mann, and many others. Chris has recorded for Partisan Records, Dynalone Records, and most recently, Verve Forecast, the longtime home of Captain Beefheart, Richie Havens, and Laura Nero. Billboard has said that his work is, quote, carefully layered, like you could peel and keep finding the song inside. Rolling Stone has favorably compared him to Paul Simon and Springsteen, no less. And Paste magazine once succinctly said, Porterfield songs can have the impact of fully formed short stories, but in only a couple hundred words. Chris and I did a monstrously long tour together 4 or 5 years ago and became good friends. I see him almost every time I come through Milwaukee, and we'd been meaning to take this podcast for a year now, and I'm so glad we finally got the chance to do it, and I finally got to hear Chris's story of his journey so far. Well, man, I'm so glad we finally got a chance to do this. We've been talking about doing it for years, kept on looking for a time to get together in person, and I finally just said, screw it, man. It's better that it happens than us keep kicking the can down the road.
Yeah, well, we're all probably going to be speaking virtually moving forward, so, self-isolation and all.
Yeah, exactly. I think this will be it. It'll just be webcasted YouTube concerts and Skyped podcast interviews. So,
yep.
Luckily, we're not in a business that's affected by this at all.
This should be a real seamless, smooth period for all of us. Should be real good.
I was joking around with my manager, saying like, "Well, they say that all big gatherings are canceled, so I don't even know that our concerts qualify." For that. So.
Yeah, right. I saw Inslee in Washington. It's like nothing over 250 people allowed. It's like, well, that shouldn't be a problem for me in Washington.
I'm good to go here. Yeah, the pug shows can go on. Well, man, I want to start before we get to your current work here. I want to start all the way back at the beginning. You were in college, or you had just gotten out of college, and you had a band that you started called DeArmond Ederson. Talk to me about those days and what music looked like for you then.
That was, I was in college when I joined that group. So that would have been, 2002, I guess. I was going to college at the University of Wisconsin, Eau Claire. And I had another band that was there. It was a band that started in our hometown of Rochester, Minnesota. And then we all took that band to Eau Claire, went to college there. And then that broke up. But while we were there, we had crossed paths with some other peers and contemporaries, one of which was this group called DeArmond Ederson. And they asked me to join that group, playing pedal steel, and that group consisted of Justin Vernon and Brad Phil Cook and Brian Moen, So it's cool because everybody from that group has gone on to do other stuff in music. Justin has a band called Bon Iver, and Brad and Phil had a group called Megafaun, and Phil has a robust solo career and also a sideband career with His Golden Messenger and a bunch of others. And Brad is a great record producer now.
I want to pause you on just the instrument that you were playing there, because I know in the year 2020, it's pretty common. I think about 30% of people under the age of 22 play pedal steel and are moving to East Nashville. But in 2002, I think my numbers are correct there. Not quite sure. But in 2002, that was it's still a pretty obscure instrument now. It was absolutely an obscure instrument then. I mean, how did you even find one up in Rochester, Minnesota, much less know what it was?
Well, that was the beginning of the internet, I guess. And so there were some shops that had them there was one Steel Guitar Nashville, and they had a fairly good-sized inventory, and eBay, of course, is a thing.
Oh, right.
And so I think I bought my first one off eBay, and it was lousy. It was essentially the mechanics underneath it were like coat hangers, and intonation was impossible, and it was just a lousy thing. So then I did some more research. There was a thing called the Steel Guitar Forum, so I learned a lot about stuff from that. And then I bought a nice one from Steel Guitar Nashville, and they shipped it up to me. And I had a Buddy Emmons ear training cassette tape, and wore that out, and just kind of learned on my own. I never really got good at it. I got good enough to fake my way into gigs for a while, but any real player could smell me after about 30 seconds. Like, oh, that guy, there's a ceiling, and there's a ceiling on all steel players. I think that you have to spend a lifetime breaking through, and I never spent enough time to break through it.
Yeah,
but I could fake it. I could fake it enough to get gigs.
Gotcha.
It was a lot of fun. It's the most beautiful instrument in the world.
It really is. It's such a, in the same way that the harmonica, I think, really mimics the human voice. I think the pedal steel, when it's in the hands of its best practitioners, can really mimic a human voice in a beautiful way.
Yeah, but it's not limited to that either. It can also do the job of a horn section or a string section. It's incredibly versatile. It's sort of been pigeonholed into this country idiom. But there's other players now that are expanding the voice of the thing, and it's just like anything that's limited by its physical whatever, and then people just sort of get used to that. But the reason that the reason that it's tuned the way that it is, or the reason that the pedals do what they do, is just because somebody wanted to make it do something that it wasn't doing before. And I think as a culture who are now several generations into recorded music and all these things, I think there's a tendency to just assume that things that have been done are the way that they need to be done. And steel guitar is a great example of that. There's so much that hasn't been done with it, that it's capable of doing with a little bit of imagination and a lot of work. And it's incredible. It's really limitless. And instruments are just that. They're instruments. They're tools for expressing the spirit of the idea of a thing. It's not something that is. It's not like a car that you get behind and drive. It's so much more than that.
I just have this picture in my mind of 18-year-old you, chain smoking at 2:00 in the morning, going down the deepest rabbit hole on pedal steel forum of all time.
That was my entire early 20s.
So there's about a 10-year period there between 2002 when you get that instrument and when the first Field Report record comes out. Is that whole 10 years with DeArmond Edison? Are you with different projects? What does that 10 years look like?
No, the DeArmond Edison thing lasted for me from like 2 to 4, I think. It was just a very brief window, just a couple of years. It was very formative. I learned a lot about music and about myself and about being in a band and playing with others and things like that.
What did you learn about being in a band and others at that time?
Man, you gotta if you can find people who are as hungry and restless as you are, then it's going to be a really meaningful experience. If anybody has to get pulled along, there's going to be friction. But I think that experience, all of us were really hungry and really curious, and really, I think there was a belief in self and one another that perhaps today wasn't the day, but at some future point, we were going to be capable of something great.
Wow.
And I still believe and hope that for myself. I still don't think today is the day, But at some point, I believe enough. There's enough belief. There's enough naivete. There's enough optimism. There's enough hunger that at some point down the road, before I exit this mortal coil, I will be capable of something great. And I think we shared that, all of us in that group, and we've all gone on to sort of pursue that in our own ways. That group ended up splitting up. The rest of them decided they wanted to move down to North Carolina. They had finished with school. They had taken it as far as they wanted to go with it. And I still had a year of school left and was in love. And so I didn't want to make the move. So I stayed in Wisconsin. Those guys moved to Carolina. Some of them are still down there. Some of them have moved back to Wisconsin. And that group didn't last very long once they moved down there, maybe another year or so. I stayed at home, or in Eau Claire rather, finished school, moved to Milwaukee, where the woman I was dating was from and had moved back to and found a job. Married her. Been here in Milwaukee since 2006. But once DeArmond Edison ended for me, which would have been about 2004, it was the first time I'd ever started writing songs. I'd always just been a sideman, sort of assisting in developing somebody else's vision.
Gotcha.
And so, so I started writing on my own then, and and have been going down that road for a while.
What was the pull there? Why wasn't the thought like, well, maybe I'll go down to Chicago and pick up with some bands and play sideman on their stuff, or here in Milwaukee? What was the pull of writing at that time, and why did it come then and not before?
I think there was something about being in. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. And I did do some of that. I did a little bit of sideman and stuff. But I think that project in particular, it really sort of excited something inside me about the possibility that maybe I did have it in me to express in that way and connect in that way, and to really front the project. And maybe that I did have something to say. I never believed that I did before. In earlier bands when I was in them, I just didn't think that I had it in me. I didn't trust myself enough. I didn't understand. It all seemed too mysterious, too much dark magic. And then I think with the DeArmond stuff, Justin would occasionally consult me for some lyric things, and I studied journalism in school, and so I always sort of enjoyed writing, and I guess sort of the absence of having those bigger ideas to share with the community, sort of behind closed doors with the group, and then in a more front-facing thing. I guess it was sort of just feeling an absence of that, and not having the same team around to convey that and build it up. And so in the absence of that fellowship, I guess I just started writing myself. And maybe I was just sad enough at that point.
Well, there's nothing like being around other people who are talented and have something going on. I mean, the best compliment that anyone can give after a show is, hey, I loved your show last week so much that I just had to leave right afterwards and go try to write a song. You know what I mean? And
yeah, totally.
And so I think, and this is something that I could remind myself to do a lot more as I get older and kind of more shut off now that I have a family, is that anytime you're in a slump, if you can just get yourself around someone who's not in a slump, that's doing something creatively vital, that's pretty much the only smelling salts that are going to get you out of that type of rut, is seeing someone else really flourish.
Dude, that's totally true. Because the act of creation, it's something that it goes beyond anything about it's not just a transformation of resources, it's an actual creation. And if you can sort of glide off of somebody else's energy in that way, absolutely, you can take some of it for yourself and turn it into something.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can totally draft off of somebody for sure.
I think big time. I think that's how it's always been done. T-Bone Burnett would say, and this is a little bit different because I think he was talking about playing, but you hear him talk about always wanting to be the worst person in the band. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, yes.
Which luckily, I've never had to struggle with that. That's been pretty pretty much how it's worked out. But yeah, I mean, and so I think always wanting to be the worst writer in the room might be the idea too. And that's why maybe I'm kind of taking the conversation sideways here, but this is where we're going. I never in the past wanted to do co-writes or anything like that. And now that I get older, I'm more and more interested in that because I think to myself, I get so tired of my same way of getting into songs and finishing them that I just want to be around other people and see their little, their ways into songs and out of songs, just to jog me and make me do something different. Have you felt that pull at all as you've gotten older?
Yeah, a little bit for sure. A few years ago, I started getting into it a little more. I think for some of us, when you come into this work sort of in an isolated way, and that's how you've been working for a long time, it can be really difficult to not feel so precious about your stuff with somebody else. But as I've gotten older, that's gotten a little more simple for me. And I have done a few co-writes. Nothing really good has come out of it so far. Nothing that I would ever use, certainly. But I'm beginning to understand that I'm a kind of an idiosyncratic writer, and some of the things that I write for me aren't good for other people, and most of the stuff that other people write isn't good for me. But that doesn't mean you can't get something out of the process.
Right.
And you cannot help but be changed at some tiny, tiny level every time you do the thing. And if you do it with somebody else, there's even more possibility, frankly.
Yeah.
Every time you get on stage, every time you get in the studio, you're changed a little bit. And so, those co-writes can be a really dynamic opportunity. And you never know when lightning's going to strike. And by that, I don't mean writing a hit. I just mean writing something wonderful, or having a new relationship, or getting some new energy, or a new insight into your process or someone else's. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I just think, you saying there, you never know when it's going to strike. That's why I've just tried to emphasize to myself in the last couple of years, just, dude, take more shots at the basket. Like, you never know. You never know when that day you just get to write Amazing Grace, and that's it. And you're probably not. Overwhelmingly, the chances that you're not going to. But the fact that it's like when you step on, I'm not a golfer, but my dad would always say the reason he liked to golf was it's the one sport. He couldn't dunk a basketball or throw a baseball 100 miles per hour, but it was the one sport where there was the outside chance that one of his shots would be just as good as one of the guys on the PGA Tour's shots. And
right.
I really believe that about songwriting. I think that you can definitely get better at it, but you can also be someone who is 2 weeks into it and write something beautiful and wonderful.
Yep, that's absolutely true. You're absolutely right. I love that.
So take me into, I love on this show really getting into how the sausage is made between you are knocking around Milwaukee with your new wife and this family that you're starting. You are kind of leaving the pedal steel and sideman stuff to the side. And then out of nowhere in 2012, you emerge with this wonderful record. How was the sausage made there? How did you get from new guy in the city who had never really written a song before to your debut?
Yeah, a lot of open mic at that point. I found a home base, an open mic home base in Milwaukee right away, and I just started going every week, and sort of just learning how to be in front of an audience who might like you, who might not. Learning how to use a microphone as an instrument, learning which fights to pick from stage and which fights to leave, and just trying out songs every week, trying to be better every week, and then finding a couple peers and contemporaries that are also hungry and trying to support them but also destroy them every week.
Right. Yeah.
And I found all that there. And so for a couple of years, that's what I was doing. and I had a couple of friends who we really believed in one another, but we believed in ourselves more, and we wanted to embarrass ourselves or embarrass them and not embarrass ourselves. And so, yeah, I just kept working at it and figuring out how to do it. And I wouldn't say I had really any idea by the time the first Field Report record came out, but I started to record some things, and this is the early frontier of Bandcamp and the end of the road of MySpace. And somebody found my stuff and reached out and said, "Hey, I work for this record label. I'd be interested in coming to talk to you about some things." And I didn't really believe it. But then he flew into Milwaukee, and we started talking, and he was sort of a kindred spirit, and he heard something in my work and wanted to open a door for me. And so, yeah, we recorded that record. It was at Justin's studio in Eau Claire in the winter of 11, and it came out in 12. And yeah,
Wow.
and things started moving.
So did that person from the label, was that Partisan Records?
Yeah, that was Partisan. That was Dave Godowski.
Gotcha.
Who found me. Do you know Dave?
I know Dave.
Did
Yeah, I met him when
Yeah.
you and I toured together. Was he managing you when you and I
Yeah,
toured
yeah,
together?
he did. Yep, he managed me for a long time. Yeah.
Yeah, that is really cool. That I feel like that's an old school story that doesn't really happen too much anymore. Just being kind of discovered like that by someone who has a vision on the kind of the business end. And then did you use the recordings that you had already done at the studio, or did you go in with him to kind of capture stuff that had already been demoed out that he had heard?
Yeah, what he had heard were some early demos, and then I had kind of assembled a cast of bandmates, and so there were 6 of us that went into the studio to record them properly, and that's what kind of became that first record.
That is, see, that's how I thought it was supposed to work when I got into this game, but yours is one of the few stories where I've heard it kind of work like that. That's really beautiful that he heard that in your tunes.
Yeah, it's amazing what we build these little things, these little ships and bottles, and bring them to flea markets or whatever, and you never know who's gonna understand what's going on inside there and who it's gonna connect with. And Dave understood what I was trying to do, and it resonated with him. And you're right, it doesn't happen that way anymore. And when people who are trying to get started now ask me for advice and how did you get in the door, I don't know what to tell them anymore, because it isn't like that, and it breaks my heart. And I feel like it gets harder and harder to know what to do every day if you're just starting out. It's really tough.
Yeah, I think it always changes like that every 5 to 10 years because fundamentally it's just a technological question. It has nothing to do with the art whatsoever. It just has to do with where our listeners, people are always going to listen to music. The question is, where are they doing it? And as that changes so rapidly because the technology changes, there's no solution that you can put in stone that will age well at all, I don't think.
Yeah, totally. I think I got it in at a funny time where we had the tools by which you could put things up for free, essentially, and so they could be discovered, but the algorithm was still undeveloped. And so you could leave people up to discover stuff on their own, and they might actually find it, and they might actually connect with it, and there's still enough mystery around it where they couldn't count it yet, and so they could guess wrong. Now you can't guess wrong anymore.
Totally. So did you tour behind that record at that point, or was that not until Marigold?
No, we did a lot of touring even before that record came out. Things kind of happened quickly for us in that window. Before the record came out, then we got a booking agent, and a lot of stuff just started happening. We did some dates with Emmylou Harris. We did somehow Adam Duritz from Counting Crows found that record before it came out. He got a copy of it, and he ended up listening to it on his way to the airport, and just kept listening to it and missed his flight.
Wow.
And then reached out and invited us to go on their summer arena tour.
Holy cow.
And so Yeah, we played Red Rocks before we had a record out. I mean, it was
That's
ridiculous.
insane. Wow.
Yeah,
What
yeah,
what was that
and we
like? I mean, this is what was it like for you with your relationship with your wife? Because up until then, you'd just been, playing some open mics in Milwaukee at home every night, and now all of a sudden you're just on the road all the time. Was she cool with that? Did she understand that was something she had signed up for? Was it difficult? How did you guys work that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd been a civilian for a few years at that point. I had a real job, and I was thinking about law school and all this stuff. And so, no, it wasn't what she signed up for. It wasn't what I signed up for. But we both recognized at that time that if I didn't take a risk and just go for it, that these opportunities that were coming up, I would resent myself forever if I didn't just go for it. And so we went for it, and it was hard. It was hard. Thankfully, it was before we had our daughter, and so it was easier to just go out and see what happened. With some curiosity and not like a sense of anxiety about insecurity. Yeah, and it took us a few years to figure out that rhythm, but she's been incredibly supportive, and that's another thing too. Honestly, I don't know how you can do this work and not have somebody back at home like supporting and believing, because it would be a real lonely place and real hard to hard to do anything without that support, because there's good times and there's lean dark times.
Yes, and even when there's good times and you're on the road. So my wife and I have been together, if not as a married couple, the whole time that I've been on the road, and I don't know that I could have mental health wise made it through the rigors of touring without having a really centered home life, without having a place that I knew I could go back to and would be the same.
Yeah. Yeah. It took us a few years to figure that out, and a lot of times, especially in the early years, I would bring all that darkness back home, and it was kind of a lousy time. I mean, things were starting to move professionally, but personally, I wasn't a lot of fun to be around, and I wasn't a good band leader. I wasn't a good husband. I wasn't a good friend. It was sort of a weird dark time. It took me a long time to figure out how to try to balance these things out.
So how did you balance out all those things? How did you become a better band leader, a better husband, a better, a better man, frankly? What changes did you have to make to get there?
I think I had to learn how to be a little bit just kind of lighter on my feet, in that all those things that you mentioned, husband, band leader, musician, writer, business owner, all those things require a lot of dedicated energy and attention. But if you lean too hard into one of them, then you're not spending that in the other. And so you really need to you never get to a point where everything just runs itself. You just get to a point where you remember to balance yourself regularly. And so you got to be able to shift your weight quickly. You got to not lean too hard into something. You got to kind of always be tap dancing and sort of keeping your balance in a little bit into everything. And I've just gotten better at that. Rather than leaning into one thing and falling over, you always just got to be moving your feet. It's just like playing defense in basketball, Yeah. You got to stay on the balls of your feet, and you got to be able to try to follow wherever the person you're guarding is going to go, and try to predict it and get your fingers up. And it's just not focusing on the one thing all the time. It's just remembering that there are all the things that you need to focus on at any given moment.
And that balance, it works in such a beautiful way. There's nothing I like more than if I've had a conversation with the guys on the business end of, hey, well, sales for this aren't going great, or this person said no to this opportunity. There's nothing more than I like than just being able to hang up the phone and then just go chase my kid around the room. You know what I mean? Then at the same time, when if we're having a tough time, I haven't slept in a while because kids are sick or they're having trouble at school, something like that. There's nothing I like more than being able to carve out an hour and a half and just try to write a song and forget about that, for a little bit.
Yeah, totally.
Because God knows I have so many hours free to myself to do that these days.
That's it. I memean, each of them require a full 8 hours.
They do.
And there aren't those hours.
I always joke around with my wife, and because I've done a lot of the childcare. My wife is a teacher, and I do a lot of childcare, and I always joke around with her about how like insane it had to be a housewife in like the 50s when your husband would come home and be like, "Well, you don't have a job. You know what I mean? What are you tired for?" Like, it's
right.
Like, dude, I totally get why you're putting your head in the oven at that point.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'm in a similar position, and that's one of the benefits and weird sort of unrecognized perks of this strange work that we do is that we can choose to take time off of it.
100%.
And yeah, and it's an incredible luxury that I yeah. But yeah, I'm in full-time stay-at-home dad mode often. And yeah, dude, like the gender shit that we still haven't figured out as a society. Like, I've got a new awareness of that. Yeah, because, I mean, you go back just a generation, and what we're doing is unheard of. And, yeah, dude, I have a way, 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 way deep respect for mothers and homemakers, because I still can't keep the house clean and chase one kid around.
Hey, I didn't say I'm keeping the house clean. I did not say that. You put words in my mouth there. Chris finds himself in the same situation as many artists when they start a family, myself included, and that is picking up the slack with childcare, because we have a job that features slack. And it's time in with your kids that you treasure, but there's also a sneaky part of you that wonders, upon leaving the workforce or just scaling back from the workforce, if you'll ever work again, if anyone would ever deign to have you back, or if you've just forfeited your one ticket to the employable rodeo. You make sacrifices for your kids, and that's nothing new, and it's nothing that any parent didn't sign up for, and it's nothing to complain about. But that sacrifice can be all those things, and it can also be true and real. Here's a wonderful poem by Robert Hayden about the sacrifices his father made for him. Those winter Sundays. Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him, who had driven out the cold, and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? You have that whole period where things are really, they're really popping off from, let's say when that first record came out in 2012. They're popping off professionally, if not, you mentioned personally, it might have been different because things weren't in balance. And then you kind of take your career takes a new turn when you sign with Verve in around 2015 or 2016. Would that have been around when it was? Can you talk about that next chapter of your career and what that looked like, and the decision-making process going in with a bigger label like that, and what you liked and didn't like about it?
Yeah, sure. So we made 2 records on that first label, and then we made a 3rd record, and we turned it into the first label, actually, and they decided they didn't want to put it out. And we were a little surprised by it, because I thought I was giving them something that they could really win with.
Was this Summertime Songs?
Yeah, Summertime Songs, which is sort of our version of a pop record, I guess. and so, but then we took it and started knocking on doors, and we found a believer in Mike Viola, who had just started doing A&R for this freshly rebooted Verve Forecast imprint, which is a subsidiary of Universal. But Verve Forecast was sort of a kind of a legendary home for a lot of folk stuff and a little bit of rock and roll stuff. And Mike is an amazing guy, and he has been a sideman and also an incredible songwriter and producer. His probably most known thing, he wrote the music for That Thing You Do.
Yeah.
And then he's played with a bunch of people and produced myriad records, and he's an amazing guy. Anyway, we found a believer in him, and so we went and joined up with him at Verve, and so they put it out. And there was some idea, some imagination that that Summertime Songs might be the thing for the moment, thinking that maybe, and these aren't my words, but some of the stuff that would come up on conference calls, like maybe this is the War on Drugs record of this year, or maybe this is the national record of this year, and
Yeah.
So there were all kinds of meetings and conference calls and budgets and all of these things, sort of chasing that down. And I just kind of, was curious and interested and open to that if it should happen. They wanted to slap a parental advisory sticker on there because I say fucker one time, but they wanted to cover their bases in case it was going to be in Walmart.
Oh, okay.
That kind of stuff. And so, when it came, obviously that didn't happen. It wasn't the thing for the time. In fact, it was probably the wrong thing for the time.
It's a great record.
Well, thanks. I think it's pretty good. I think if you meet it halfway, it's pretty damn good. But so we did some touring on that, and by the end of that cycle, we just sort of limped out of it, and it's like, oh boy, this is not the thing. And
how did Mike Viola help shepherd you through that whole process?
Well, yeah, it's interesting because we gave him a finished record, so he didn't have anything to do with making the record,
Right?
And I think I would love to have made that record with him just to see where it would have landed. Yeah, he would come see us play, and he would sort of give me advice on how to be a better band leader and how to convey things and what to think about and what not to think about. Because he's been on stage forever.
What did he tell you not to think about?
Don't think about anything that isn't connecting. Like, don't think about technical stuff.
Yeah.
Just think about connecting with the audience. And that was one of the things too. We had a lot of tech stuff with that record, with samples and synthesizers and guitar pedals and all this stuff. It was sort of primed for arenas that it never really reached.
Okay. I know the feeling well, my friend.
Yeah, and so by the time that touring season wrapped up, it didn't sell several 100,000 copies. I know that much. And so it didn't take long for the calls from the accountants to come and say, well, we're not going to put out another Field Report record.
Sure.
And so that sort of spun me for a while. I went through a dark period last year, sort of figuring out what's next.
Mm-hmm.
I still haven't quite figured out what's next. But I've started my own label in order to have a venue or a place to put stuff out and to not wonder about it, to not worry about it, to not have to have anybody else's ideas and opinions in mind while I'm making something. and just to move faster. I'm pretty interested in not being involved in campaigns ever again after that one.
Yes.
I never want to do a 6-month build-up and a 6-month rollout and Instagram takeovers and all of this stuff. Like, I never want to do that again. And so I won't. Yeah, and so I've just kind of been putting out music a little bit as it comes, and recently decided, well, shit, what's a record in 2020? I don't even know. But I've got this group of songs that feels like something, and so we're going to put that out pretty soon. And
talk to me a little bit about the process of putting that together. I know that you usually have a dedicated space where you like to go and write, and I also know that for you, it seems like the writing and recording process have been getting closer and closer together. I know you work at a studio pretty regularly there in Milwaukee. Talk to me about what your process looks like today.
Yeah, I've got a demo studio at home and then access to a proper studio in Milwaukee. Yeah, and, you know, I'm gathering all the time, sort of low-key gathering ideas and stuff, either notes on a phone or pocket notebook or whatever. And so, yeah, I'll gather a bunch of ideas for a while, and then when it's time, and I don't always know when it's going to be time, but when it's time, that'll turn into a song, and then I'll demo it up at home, probably do 3 or 4 demos at home, and then bring it into the studio. A lot of times stuff that starts in a home demo will make it into the bed track at the studio. Then I'll bring in my people, which is drummer Devin Drobka, bassist Barry Clark, keys player Tom Winsek, and guitarist and singer Kaylee Conway. And then usually it'll sort of be whoever's available whenever can come in, and we'll track that stuff. But sometimes I'll do it on the floor. And then Daniel Holter, who runs the studio and also the label, will mix it. And I don't know. And then we've just kind of been working one song at a time lately, as opposed to thinking about, well, how is this song fitting in with this other song as far as track 2 and 8 in the series of 10 and a record that has to be one cohesive idea. And, oh, maybe we should finish up the bass on this song. That is this song that we've started. You know, we've just been doing one song independently at a time, and it's been amazing. I keep thinking about it in terms of like making ships and bottles, because you can't really do that in an assembly line fashion. You got to take your time and sort of be aware of what's happening within each thing, and each time you learn something different. Yeah, but it's been a really freeing process doing it that way. And then we got to a point recently where I was like, well, man, we've got all these different pieces, and I finally listened to them back to back in a certain order, and it was like, whoa, I think that's a record.
Yeah.
It's crazy when you do work and it starts to pile up, and then you start to treat it differently because there's a pile of it.
Yes. Yes.
You get that way?
Well, I think just to explain to some of our listeners who might not necessarily do this type of stuff, I think what you're referring to is the way that a lot of times a record gets made is you have a big batch of songs and you go through and maybe you have drum and bass day where you get all that laid down for every song. Like, so that'd be like the foundation. Then you come through and do vocals, and then you come through and do all the, you know, the melodic stuff. Is that kind of the old process you were talking about? So you're working on like a batch. So I've, I'd never really recorded in that batch way, myself, because for the most part, it would always be, besides one record I did in 2012, the vocals would tend to be live, and we would cut it live. But I always would have the batch of songs. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And I think that, to me, sounds like the biggest difference because, I suppose you would think of it differently. You do think of it differently when it's a batch of songs. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You just do. And you could be like, wow, this one's not really coming through right now, but that's okay because this other song really came on strong today. Whereas maybe if you were working on that one song, you would drill down and find out what wasn't working about it because that's all you had for the day.
Yeah, and I think that's true. Yeah, and there's not. Yeah, it's hard to explain, but it was a huge shift for me. And it's, I think part of it too is that, I mentioned, like, you step back and look at the pile, and suddenly all the work it takes on a different gravity because there's a pile of it. I think before there was always a pile sort of running through the process, but this time around I didn't recognize the pile until it was done.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot
of
sense.
And that for some reason, like, was a really big thing for me. Just looking at the pile afterward, like just being in the one thing at a time, and then gathering the pile after, rather than sort of being aware of the process the whole time, being like, I know I've got a pile of like 3 pieces over here, and like there's these other 5 that are sort of this far along, and with the goal of getting them all over the finish line to make a thing. This time around, I just made them one at a time and found each one satisfying and interesting and compelling in its own way. And then at the end of it, I was like, oh, there's a pile of stuff. Whoa, I think that's a record.
I wonder if that has to do with you've been writing songs for 10 or 15 years and you just have a better facility for doing it now. So maybe this wouldn't have even been an option to work like this 10 or 15 years ago because there was so much stuff to learn.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, and I'm another thing about this season of writing for me is I've not been doing it for anyone other than me. I'm sort of doubling down on the fact that I'm kind of the only one who can write my stuff, and there are millions of other people who are better at writing stuff that I can't do. And so I should not try to do any of that stuff, and I should only do the stuff that only I can do. And that was a big sort of epiphany for me also, because I think I've been trying to have it both ways for a long time, and I've recently decided that doesn't do anyone any good.
No, it does. I mean, it is that paradox of, the 2 things in my life creatively that I've done, just really for myself, because I wanted to hear the piece of work, which was my first record, and then this podcast. Those are the 2 things. I just wanted to hear what it would sound like. Those are the 2 things in my creative life, paradoxically, that have connected with other people the most. It's a trip.
Interesting.
It's an absolute freaking trip, man. I don't understand it in the least.
Yeah, it's mysterious, isn't it? You try to do things consciously or not that other people will have an easier time connecting with, and it's not what they connect with. If there's something that has to be resonant within you that echoes when somebody else experiences it, that and it's a deep, dark mystery. And I think for me, I think I always understood that, but I wanted to try to cast a wider net.
Yes.
And to try to open that door up for many people to experience. But when you do that, sometimes you turn off the believers. And
yes.
And I think I've gone back and forth, and at this point now, I just want to do the stuff that really only I can do.
Yes. And luckily we happen to be in to be crass about it, we happen to be in a marketplace with music where it's now more possible to do that than it ever has been. To have your little, I won't call it little, I would call it like your very specific, there's very specific avenues to get your stuff out in a way that I think even 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago, it just wouldn't exist. You couldn't get the music to the people who would want to hear it efficiently,
Right. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. It's totally true. I mean, we could write a song today, record it today, and have it up for anyone in the world to hear by the end of the day. Like, that's possible.
Yes.
That's insane. And before, when everything was beholden to physical, that would take months and months and months and months.
Yes.
And so, the ability to move quickly is a huge luxury, provided that you've already found some kind of audience that knows to find it where you're putting it.
Well, yeah, and that's the rub. And like you said earlier, so I wouldn't know what to say to people that were starting out. But if you have some people that are already following you and they're kind of keyed into what you're doing, they're interested. They might not be in for every project, but every time you put one out, they're going to put their ears on it. Then you can kind of be in a good place with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so.
I mean, I'm not saying that either one of us are going to release our next record and it's going to set the Steel Guitar Forum on fire, but...
Oh, the Forumites. The Forumites would not be into Field Report. Even though they steal on a bunch of stuff, they would not be into Field Report. I haven't checked in on the forum for a while. Maybe it's I got to do that. I got to check in on the forum.
Oh, man.
But yeah, dude, I think, it's kind of like you were talking about or alluding to, I'm super divesting from like music business dreams. I'm out of the dreams business.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to make music, and it's great that there are a dozen people out there somewhere that are going to listen to what I do. Yep. And ultimately that's it, right? I mean, it sucks, but the work has to be enough.
It has to be. Otherwise
it has to be.
Yeah.
And I'm doing my taxes right now. Man, last year was a nightmare. Thank God I could justify my existence by providing childcare.
Yes.
Because otherwise, my value is real unquantifiable for my family at this moment.
Sure.
But damn, the work has to be enough.
It does.
If it isn't enough, then it's not enough. Then you do something else.
Then do something else. Yeah, that's, the way I've always thought it, because every year, you mentioned earlier, one of the hats we wear is a small business owner. And every year I get to the end of the year and I'm like, okay, is it responsible for me to do another year doing this? And so far the answer has been yes. And that's great. And thank God for that. But I've always thought, I really would be at peace doing something else if I could just continue to make the art. You know what I mean? I firmly believe that. And the reason why is, and to kind of put a bow on this here, you mentioned, when you were first going out on the road a lot, and these opportunities were put in front of you, you and your wife knew that you had to do it because otherwise you'd spend a lifetime wondering what if. And one of the great parts about having played music for the past 10 or 15 years myself is no matter what happens, I will never have to ask myself, what if? You know what I mean?
Sure.
I really, no matter what happens, I can look myself in the mirror and be like, well, I found out what if, and that's cool. That's the whole point, was to find out what if,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. That's beautiful. Yeah. And what a gift. Yeah. What a gift to have that little piece of uncertainty reduced.
Yeah. Well, man, I told you that I was going to end this podcast by just shitting on the Milwaukee Bucks and the terrible week that you guys just had. But I don't have the heart in me to do it. I'm going to leave you alone. You guys are having an incredible season.
Yeah, hey, everybody needs a bad week, and this is a good time to have a bad week.
It's a really good time.
'Cause then you can make some adjustments rolling into the postseason. I don't think we're going to be in any danger of getting knocked off the first seed. We're kind of following a trajectory that's shaped like Toronto's last year.
That's very true. That's very true.
Yeah, and Giannis has been out for the last several games. He'll be back. He'll be fine. He's just taking a break. Hurt his leg a little bit, but it's not a big deal. My man George Hill, he's been out. He's our fearless veteran leader. The team is 100 times better when he's on the bench or in the game, because we're still young. We're still figuring some stuff out. Well, we're going to be okay.
That sounds good. Just you can give me a call on the day that LeBron wins the MVP this year, and I'll be there to sop your tears, my friend. Dude, I'm so glad we finally got to do this. I would like to do this again sometime, man. I learned a lot rapping with you today. This was fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, dude. I love your podcast. I really do. I listen to it pretty regularly.
Okay, man. Love to your family, and talk to you soon, man.
Likewise. Take care.
Peace. This week's show is brought to you by Bandzoogle. Built by musicians and for musicians, Bandzoogle is an all-in-one platform to build a beautiful website for your music. Use promo code TWS, the initials of our podcast, TWS, to get 15% off the first year of any subscription. That's our show for this week. Field Report's latest album, which just came out, is entitled Break Light Red Tide, available everywhere music is sold or streamed. If before we meet again you sit down to write, please remember, an expensive drug habit is not a song, a compelling Instagram account is not a song, and most importantly, reverb is not a song. So let all that take care of itself, and for you, just keep your eye on the song.